We're now going to start Chapter 2, which is a theory of individual labor supply. This is the most basic level at which we can analyze labor markets because we're looking at the decision that an individual makes to work or to not to work. This is known as the work-leisure decision. Work is time spent in a paying job. Leisure is time not spent in a paying job. And that means that leisure includes all non-paying activities. So even though you may not feel like when you're not working, you're engaging in leisure, you are. Education, rest, sleep, household work, all fall under the umbrella of leisure because they are not being done in a paying job. But when you go to work, you do get money in the form of wages and income, which can then be used to purchase goods. The opportunity cost of work is leisure and vice versa. And if you look across the globe, you'll see different countries have different hours worked per year. This data is from 2014, but I've pulled up this link here, which will give us a better sense of what this looks like today. So this is from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and it shows the hours worked across countries for 2021. And notice on the far right here, we have, let me see, it should pop up, but it's Mexico. It's not showing up. It's Mexico. And then if you go a step over, it's Costa Rica, and then Colombia, Chile, and South Korea. So these countries are high worker hour years. If you go to the lower countries, you've got Germany, you've got Denmark, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. This may not be surprising to a lot of people because I think a lot of European countries are kind of known for having more leisure time and emphasizing non-work activities. But no doubt these are different across the globe and across time. So if you go back in history, you'll find that the work week was much longer in the past than it is today in most countries. We're going to build a model known as an indifference curve model that helps us understand the thought process that an individual would go through in determining how much to work and how much to engage in leisure. On the horizontal axis here, we're going to put leisure, and leisure can be from 0 to 24 hours in a day. On the vertical axis, we're going to put income. Income can just be in dollars, but for now we can just think of it as some sort of monetary unit. Notice that on the horizontal axis, we're putting leisure, but in order to simplify things, we could also create an inverse, which is hours of work. For example, if you have 0 hours of leisure, then that's 24 hours of work. If you have 24 hours of leisure, that's 0 hours of work. So see how these work to exhaust the entire day. The indifference curve shows the leisure income combinations that yield the same amount of total utility. Remember, utility is effectively satisfaction, happiness. And so at every point on this curve, the utility happiness is the same. What does that mean? Well, it means that for this individual, in their mind, point A, which is a high level of income and a low level of leisure, gives them the same level of satisfaction as point D, which is a low level of income and a high level of leisure. The indifference curve is always downward sloping because in order to keep a person at the same total utility, when they get more of one thing, in this case leisure, they must give up the other thing, income, hence the negative slope. You'll also note that this indifference curve is convex to the origin, which means it's bowed inward towards the origin. This illustrates a diminishing slope. Example, if you're currently, this person, right, This is your indifference curve and your evaluation of the trade-off between income and leisure. If you're currently contemplating point A, you're thinking of a high level of income and a low level of leisure. It looks like 3 hours of leisure and some large income level. If you go to point B, which is going to get you 1 more hour of leisure, well, that extra hour of leisure will make you better off. So in order to keep you indifferent, we got to take away some money. How much money? 4 units of money. If we get you 1 more hour of leisure, you get 1 more hour of leisure, and you lose 4 units of income, you are at the same total utility as before. So the slope between A and B is 4 over 1, which is 4. More specifically, negative 4. But notice that if instead of starting at point A and adding an hour of leisure to go to point B, let's start at point C and add an hour of leisure and go to D. Here you have 8 hours of leisure and you're going to go to 9. Well, an extra hour of leisure makes you better off. So we need to take away some income to make you indifferent, to keep you at the same level of total utility. How much income do we need to take away? 1 unit. The slope between C and D is therefore 1 over 1, which is 1, or more specifically, negative 1. Notice that in both cases, going from 3 to 4 hours of leisure and 8 to 9 hours of leisure, you got 1 more hour of leisure. But the trade-off in terms of income was greater when you had when you're going from 3 to 4. The trade-off is much smaller when you go from 8 to 9. This trade-off is also called the marginal rate of substitution. So it tells us the rate at which this person is willing to substitute leisure for income. If this person has 8 hours of leisure, they're willing to substitute 1 unit of income to get 1 more unit of leisure. Note also that because of the diminishing slope / marginal rate of substitution, we're seeing that as they get more leisure, their willingness to trade off income diminishes. The marginal rate of substitution diminishes. This is likely a result of having more of one good relative to another. If we have more leisure relative to income, leisure becomes less valuable compared to income, and thus we're not willing to trade off as much income for another unit of leisure. If I've got 18 hours of leisure a day, giving me an extra hour doesn't mean much to me in terms of happiness, but the income I would have to give up to get that might be very valuable. On the other hand, if I have a lot of income and very little leisure, say 2 hours, then giving me an extra hour of leisure means a lot to me, so I'm willing to give up a lot of income to get it. Keep in mind that when we look at any indifference curve, we're seeing an individual's willingness to trade off 2 items for each other in their mind. This is their psychology, and it varies by each individual. So your willingness to trade off income for leisure will be different than mine and will be different than other people. It may also change across time. But at a point in time for a specific individual, we can think about the psychological trade-offs that they're analyzing with this indifference curve. Going from an indifference curve to what's called an indifference map simply means adding all possible indifference curves to our model. Now, if we added them all, it would be visually unappealing and difficult to interpret. So we've allowed for just 3 separate indifference curves here. But technically, there is an infinite amount of indifference curves that move out from a 45-degree line to infinity. Let's say we were just looking at indifference curve 1. We recognize the trade-off that that particular individual was willing to make between leisure and income while still maintaining the same level of utility. But if this person can reach a higher indifference curve, then that would mean that they would have more of one good while keeping the other, say more income while keeping the same amount of leisure, or more leisure, move this way, while keeping the same amount of income, or more of both. In any of those three scenarios, the individual will have a higher total utility. So getting to a higher indifference curve further away from the origin implies this person is getting a higher utility. The goal would always be to reach the highest indifference curve possible. So in a perfect world where this person has no constraints, they would reach I3 if that is the highest indifference curve possible. But the real world does come with constraints, and we're going to look at that in a minute, make our model more realistic. Before we do that, let's talk about the work-leisure preferences and how the indifference curve steepness or flatness illustrates this. On the left-hand side here, we have relatively flat indifference curves. This implies a lower slope, which implies a lower marginal rate of substitution. In other words, as this person gets more leisure, their willingness to trade off income is low. Now, what would that mean for a person, typical person? Well, if you give someone more leisure and their willingness to trade off income is very low, then they simply don't value leisure that much. And we might call this person a workaholic, just for simplicity. Another way to think about this is not by adding more leisure, but by taking it away. Sometimes that makes more intuitive sense in the model. If we take away this person's leisure, this would imply that they're not going to require much of an increase in income to stay indifferent. As a result, they're a workaholic. Shifting from these flatter indifference curves to steeper ones means shifting from somebody that is a workaholic to a leisure lover. For this person, when they get more leisure, you can see the slope is very high, very steep, meaning their marginal rate of substitution is high, and their willingness to trade off income for leisure is high. This is a leisure lover. Give them a little more leisure, and they're willing to give up a lot of income. Again, work it the other way. If we take away leisure and move to the left, you would have to pay them a lot in income to get them to stay indifferent. Leisure lovers are people that value their free time. And to get them to give up that free time, you're going to have to pay them a lot. Workaholics are people that probably love their job and don't value their free time as much. Maybe their free time is boredom, and maybe their job is their hobby. Either way, to get them to give up leisure doesn't take much money. It's always relative, though. So by looking at these two, we can see a clear difference between a leisure lover and a workaholic. Think about where you might land, and note that where you are right now might be different than where you were years ago and where you'll be many years from now. We'll see later on that a lot of people, when they're younger and get that first job out of college, first career job out of college, they become workaholics, and they end up having very flat indifference curves. But as they get older and they get a family and maybe even start to venture into retirement, they start to move towards leisure lovers. Now let's shift to the budget constraint. This is going to be the part of the model that makes our decision making realistic. Because so far, all we've really looked at with the indifference curve is the trade-off an individual is willing to make while maintaining the same level of utility. It doesn't tell us what trade-off they will make. For that, we need the budget constraint. Notice that the axes are the same. Hours of leisure on the horizontal, income on the vertical. The budget constraint has a negative slope, but it is a linear relationship. It is a constant slope, and the slope is equal to the wage. For example, as this person moves from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on hours of leisure, they are giving up income at a rate of whatever the wage is. We'll pick up on the rest of this in the next video.